first thing Genevieve noticed was her own coat on the floor. Not hung, not folded, dropped. The way you'd drop something that belonged to no one, something you'd found in a lost and found bin and couldn't be bothered to return. It was the camel wool coat she'd bought in Chicago 2 winters ago, the one with the brass buttons, her mother had said. Made her look like she had somewhere important to be. It was on the marble floor of the Whitmore family estate, and standing over it, not even looking at it anymore, was her mother-in-law, Constance Whitmore. "I've had Paulette clear out the east guest room," Constance said. She was addressing her son, not Genevieve. She had not looked at Genevieve directly in 4 minutes. "The linens are fresh. You two can stay there tonight." "We're not guests," Genevieve said quietly. Constance finally turned. She had the kind of face that never quite finished an expression. She'd begin a smile and leave it incomplete, like a sentence trailing off at the comma. "Of course not, sweetheart," she said, "family." But the coat stayed on the floor. That was the night Genevieve Calloway, 36 years old and 3 years into her marriage, to the Whitmore family's youngest son, understood something she had been slowly learning without the words for it. The Whitmore family did not see her. They saw what she represented. A daughter-in-law who asked nothing, carried no name worth trading on, came from Dayton, Ohio, and had the particular stillness of someone who had been raised to be grateful. They saw a woman who could be accommodated, not welcomed, accommodated. Her husband's name was Beckett Whitmore. He was 39, handsome, in the particular way of men who've never had to try very hard, with his father's jaw and his mother's talent for making rooms feel smaller. He was not cruel. That was the thing Genevieve returned to, again and again, in the early years. He was not a cruel man. He was something more corrosive than that. He was a man who loved comfort more than he loved any particular person, and Genevieve had, for a long time, been comfortable to love. His family was old money that had learned new tricks. Randall Whitmore, Beckett's father, had inherited a mid-size regional construction firm and turned it into something considerably larger. Whitmore Development Group, 40 years in business, a portfolio that stretched from Cincinnati to Charlotte. Shopping centers, mixed-use corridors, a few high-end residential towers. The kind of company that got its name on hospital wings and university buildings and never had to advertise because everyone in the right rooms already knew it. The company had made the family rich. The company was, in every conversation Genevieve had ever sat through at a Whitmore dinner table, the sun around which everything else orbited. What no one at those dinners ever knew, what Beckett himself had never thought to ask about, because you don't ask about the weather when you assume you know the forecast, was that the ground beneath the Whitmore Development Group had shifted, quietly, without announcement. 3 years before she married Beckett, Genevieve Calloway had co-founded a real estate investment trust with 2 partners she'd met during her MBA program at Northwestern. The trust was called Ardent Capital Group. At the time of her wedding, it managed a little over $800 million in assets. By the 3rd anniversary of that wedding, the one where Constance gave them a crystal bowl, and Beckett's older sister, Rosamond, commented on how lovely it was that Genevieve had kept herself together after turning 35. Ardent Capital Group managed slightly under $4 billion. She had not mentioned this at the dinner. She had not mentioned it at most dinners. This was not deception, exactly. It was omission in the same way that the ocean omits the depth when you look at it from the shore. The Whitmore family had never asked. They had seen Genevieve's resume. She worked in commercial real estate consulting. She had a salary. She attended conferences. They understood she was competent, professional, presentable. But competent in the Whitmore vocabulary was a polite ceiling, and they had placed her neatly beneath it and gone on with their lives. Beckett knew she was a partner at Ardent. He had once seen a document with the letterhead on her desk, and she had explained it plainly. She and 2 others ran an investment trust. They pooled institutional money. They acquired and repositioned commercial real estate assets. He had nodded the way people nod when they've heard enough to feel they understand. He had not asked what repositioned meant in dollar terms. He had not asked about the portfolio. He had asked if dinner was the chicken or the salmon, because they had a reservation at 7. She had married him anyway. She had loved him in the way you love something that fits your life without quite filling it, and for a while that had seemed like enough. It stopped being enough somewhere around the 4th year. She noticed it first in the small things. The way he'd speak over her at family gatherings and then glance at her afterward, not to apologize, just to confirm she hadn't made a face. The way he'd relay her opinions to his parents as if he'd thought of them himself, not out of malice, but out of a habit so old he'd stopped noticing it. The way he'd started arriving home later. The way the phone he used to leave on the kitchen counter now traveled with him room to room. Face down, his name was coming up as well. Not in anything she saw directly. It was more the way people said nothing, the particular silence of people who know something and have agreed not to say it. Rosamond had a silence like that. Constance had a silence like that. Even the family's longtime housekeeper, a woman named Delphine, who had known the Whitmore children since they were small, had a silence like that around Genevieve. She stopped asking. The woman's name, when Genevieve eventually learned it, was Aurelia. She worked in marketing at one of Beckett's development partners, a boutique firm that handled the brand positioning for Whitmore's residential towers. She was 31. Her Instagram was full of rooftop restaurants and weekend trips and a particular golden light that tends to appear in photographs taken by someone who has recently been given things. Genevieve found out on a Tuesday in February, and then she went to work. She had a presentation at 9, a 40-minute breakdown of a proposed acquisition in Nashville for a pension fund client, and she gave it cleanly, without losing a sentence. Her colleague Thad told her it was her best work in months. She said thank you. She went to her office, closed the door, and sat very still for 11 minutes. Then she called her attorney. Her attorney's name was Philippa Strom, and Philippa had the quality of someone who had heard everything and been surprised by none of it. She asked 3 questions. Genevieve answered all 3. Philippa said she'd have documents drafted within 10 days. What happened next was not a confrontation. There were no raised voices. There was no scene of the kind Genevieve had half imagined in the days that followed. No dinner table revelation, no moment where she laid everything out and watched Beckett's face. She had imagined that scene, had rehearsed it without meaning to, and then had set it down. Didn't serve anything. She wasn't interested in the performance of justice. She was interested in the actual thing. She filed in March. Beckett received the papers on a Thursday evening. He called her twice. She let both go to voicemail. The second message was longer. He wanted to talk, he said. He needed to understand what was happening. He didn't think it had to be this way. He used the word blindsided twice, which she found interesting given everything. She texted back, "My attorney will be in touch with yours. Please route everything there." The following Sunday she drove to the Whitmore estate because Constance had asked her to come and speak face-to-face as women before things go further. Genevieve had considered saying no. Then she decided she wanted to be in the room for this particular conversation. Constance was in the sitting room off the main foyer. She had coffee arranged on the low table, 2 cups which Genevieve thought was a minor grace. Randall was nowhere visible. Rosamond was, which was a minor choice. She was arranged in the far chair with the posture of someone who had arrived as a witness. "We'd like to ask you to reconsider," Constance said, "for the sake of the family." "I have considered it," Genevieve said. At length, Beckett made a mistake. Constance said this the way you'd say a child broke a lamp, not diminishing it exactly, but categorizing it in a way that made breakage expected, forgivable, and ultimately about the lamp's fragility. "Men do. That doesn't mean the marriage is over." "I appreciate you saying that," Genevieve said. "The marriage is over." Rosamond leaned forward. She had her mother's incomplete expressions. "I think what we're all concerned about is how this plays out. The development group is in a sensitive position right now. There are projects mid-cycle, investors who have relationships with our family. A messy divorce doesn't help anyone." Genevieve looked at her. "I'm not planning anything messy." She drove home and called Thad. She asked him to pull everything they had on Whitmore Development Group's current portfolio positioning. She already knew most of it, but she wanted the full picture in front of her. What the Whitmore family did not know, what Beckett's quiet evenings with Aurelia had kept him from ever learning, was that Ardent Capital Group had, over the previous 18 months, quietly assembled a meaningful position in 3 of Whitmore Development Group's most critical upcoming projects. Not as a partner, not as anything Beckett's family had been formally introduced to. The positions had come through feeder vehicles, through a secondary investment entity, through the kind of institutional layering that is entirely standard and entirely invisible to anyone who doesn't sit in the rooms where it gets arranged. The total exposure was significant, not controlling, but significant enough that the relevant people, the pension funds, the institutional co-investors, the 2 regional banks that had extended credit lines to Whitmore's newest mixed-use development in Columbus, had Ardent Capital Group's phone number. And Ardent Capital Group was, it turned out, in a delicate period of its own. Genevieve had quietly notified the Ardent board in late February that she would be stepping back from a management role during a personal transition. The board had expressed support and made the appropriate adjustments. What this meant in practice was that her 2 co-founders, a man named August Fielder and a woman named Diane Coslow, both of whom had been with her since the beginning, both of whom had met Beckett exactly once at a firm anniversary dinner and formed no particular impression, were now the faces of Ardent's active management. The Columbus project hit a financing snag in April. It was not a catastrophic snag. It was the kind of problem that required a conversation, a restructuring of terms, a show of confidence from the investment side. Whitmore's development team reached out to Ardent. August and Diane took the call. Genevieve was not on that call. She was having lunch with Philippa, who told her that Beckett's attorney had made an initial proposal regarding asset division that was, Philippa's word, optimistic. How optimistic? Genevieve asked. He's proposing you take the condo in Hoboken and a cash settlement. Genevieve ate a bite of her salad. And Ardent? They appear to believe it's a standard consulting partnership, salary-based. They've listed it in the disclosure as a professional services arrangement. Interesting, Genevieve said. I'll need your full documentation by end of week. You'll have it Monday morning. The call between August, Diane, and Whitmore's development team did not go the way Whitmore's people expected. This was not because Ardent was adversarial. They were professional, calm, and specific. They had concerns about the project's current capitalization structure. They were going to need additional information before they could confirm their continued participation. They would be in touch. Beckett called that evening. Not Genevieve's cell. He called her office line, which she thought was a strange choice, and which she did not answer. He called her cell 10 minutes later. She answered. What's happening with Columbus? He said. He didn't say hello. I don't know what you mean, she said. Ardent Capital is pulling back, or signaling they might. Do you know something about this? There was a pause. She let it sit for a moment the way she had learned to let silences sit, not filling them, not rescuing the other person from them. Beckett, she said, you told your attorneys that I'm a salaried consultant. He didn't say anything. You filed that in a legal disclosure document. We were going off what I knew, he said. You never really explained. You never asked, she said. That's different. She ended the call. The following week, Beckett's attorney contacted Philippa with a revised proposal. The revision was notably different from the first. The week after that, Beckett's father called Genevieve directly. She had not spoken to Randall Whitmore in nearly 2 months. His voice on the phone was the voice of a man who had spent 40 years being the largest person in every room, and had recently discovered that some rooms were larger than he'd realized. I'd like to understand, Randall said, the nature of your company's involvement in our projects. I think that's a conversation for your development team and Ardent's management, Genevieve said. I've stepped back from day-to-day operations, but you're still a partner. I'm still a co-founder, she said. Yes. There was a long pause. You should have told us, Randall said, not angry exactly, something more like the flatness of a man recalculating. You never asked, she said again. I've found that when people don't ask, they've usually decided they already know the answer. She did not say it with heat. She said it the way you state something that has been true for a long time and has simply now come into the light. The divorce proceedings moved into their formal stage in May. The asset disclosure, once corrected, once Genevieve's attorneys had submitted documentation that properly characterized her ownership position at Ardent, her carried interest, her co-founder equity, the management fees, the portfolio valuation, changed the shape of the conversation considerably. Beckett's attorney requested a meeting. Then another. The optimistic initial proposal became a memory. Constance called once. She said she felt there had been a misunderstanding. Genevieve said she didn't think there had been. She said it kindly. She said she hoped everyone was well. She meant it, to whatever degree that was possible. Rosersman did not call. Aurelia, who had apparently believed, or been led to believe, that Beckett was a more straightforward prospect than he'd turned out to be, was no longer appearing in his social orbit in the ways she had been. Genevieve learned this secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, and felt nothing in particular about it. That was Beckett's life to navigate. She had enough navigation of her own. The settlement was finalized in August. It was fair. It was not the condo in Hoboken and a cash payment. Philippa called her when it was done and said, "Good outcome," in the tone of someone who rarely says that, and means it every time. Genevieve went back to the office the next day. The Nashville acquisition had closed well. There was a new opportunity in Denver that August wanted her eyes on. Diane had sent her a congratulatory text the evening before, just 3 words, "You okay?" "Good." And that had been enough. She did not think about Constance's sitting room very much in the months that followed. She did not think about Rosamond in the far chair with her witness posture. She thought occasionally about the coat on the floor, the camel wool one with the brass buttons, and she found that the memory had lost most of its weight. It was just a coat. She'd had it dry cleaned, and it was hanging in her closet in the apartment she'd leased in March, a corner unit on the 14th floor with west-facing windows and no family crystal in the cabinets. She thought sometimes about what Randall had said, "You should have told us," and about the gap between what he meant and what he understood. He meant, "You should have warned us. You should have managed our understanding of you before it became relevant to us. You should have made yourself known in terms we could evaluate and file away." She understood what he meant. She simply disagreed with the premise. She had been known. She had been exactly who she was. Every year of her marriage, at every dinner table, in every room where her coat had been hung or not hung. She had worked and built and said plainly what she did when anyone had cared enough to ask. No one had been misled. No one had been deceived. Some people build things quietly, not to hide them, just because no one asks. And then one day the building is finished, and it is very tall, and everyone is surprised, and you are not required to apologize for the architecture. She signed the ardent documents that had been waiting since February and sent them back to the board. She poured herself coffee. Outside the west-facing windows, the city was doing what cities do in late summer, running, accumulating, building things without stopping to explain itself. She did not feel triumphant. She felt accurate, like something that had been slightly off-center for a long time had finally settled into its right position, quiet and permanent and true.